We start this hour in the Middle East, and fighting in Syria's southern city of Sweida has reportedly ceased after Druze fighters recaptured the city, pushing out rival factions. The Syrian Interior Ministry confirmed that tribal fighters have evacuated and clashes in the city have stopped following a ceasefire agreement brokered by the United States. This agreement also aims to avert further Israeli military intervention in the region. The violence in Sweida, which has left more than 900 people reportedly dead in sectarian clashes, saw Israeli airstrikes earlier this week targeting Syrian government forces accused of atrocities against Druze civilians. While the ceasefire has restored control to Druze fighters in the city, tensions do persist as fighting has continued in other parts of the province. Meanwhile, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has called on Syria's security forces to prevent jihadist groups like ISIS from entering the region. Well, further instability, but optimism over this ceasefire and calls from the US as well as within the region. Joining us to discuss those, Shruti Dasgupta, an international affairs expert who is joining us live from New Delhi. As always, Shruti, thank you for taking the time to speak with us. This situation is, of course, a complex one. A ceasefire is holding, it seems, but tensions still flaring up. Let's look at the actual fighting that has been happening. Reports of Druze fighters regaining control of Sweida. How significant is that news if peace is going to last in a region that has seen hundreds of deaths due to sectarian violence?
Greetings, Joshua. Thank you for inviting me. I understand that the Druze fighters have been very strong in their attempts to ensure that their very micro-minority community is not wiped out under the hands of the Islamists and jihadists that have taken control of large parts of Syria. Al-Shara, as a former Al-Qaeda member and a Muslim Brotherhood advocate, it has been placed by the US to control these very groups that were being utilized by Iranian proxies to ensure that Syria stays not favorable towards Israel. So now Israel had attacked, as you have previously mentioned in your report, and that had led to the Syrian authorities to take it a little more seriously. And when the US stepped in and said that please ensure that this does not turn into an ISIS zone where sectarian violence in the form of jihad is continued, then Al-Shara had to make out that announcement and calling for ceasefire. So, but although if you follow social media or any other form of communication, you'll find that there are spats of firing happening all around. And this is not just targeted towards the Druze, it is also targeted towards the Syrian Christians. And the Greek Orthodox Church has also issued a worldwide appeal for help in the Sweida region as well. So you can understand that this is as much as an ethnic cleansing as a sectarian violence as has been presented by the Syrian authorities.
Yes, and Shruti, let's look at that US intervention, of course taking part in brokering this ceasefire deal, but also Marco Rubio pushing the Syrian government to make sure that this violence is stamped out and avoided where possible. Why do you think the US is so heavily involved in at least the diplomacy of this sectarian violence and the situation in Syria? Of course, we saw sanctions lifted, a meeting between Ahmed al-Shura and Donald Trump in the Arab states. This really is a point which the US are looking at. Can you explain why?
Well, that's an excellent question. And the US is completely involved in the regime change that happened in Syria. The Alawites, that were a minority group of Syria, was led under Assad regime, and that Assad regime was more loyal towards the Russian factions, and via Russia through more loyal towards Iran. That entire scenario was disrupted by this regime change, and they've done exactly what they did in Afghanistan. They've placed a man in uniform, taken him out, changed his name from Al-Jalani to Al-Shara, and put him on the seat of power, hoping that they can control the narrative as well as the flow of ideology in the nation. But as I've said before, you can take a man out of uniform, but you cannot take him out of the ideology that he follows. This is exactly why the US is interfering. One is that they were responsible for what is happening. The deaths of the Christians is on US. The deaths of the Druze is on the US. the death of Alawites is on the US. This is not a Sunni versus Shia. This is basically Muslim Brotherhood taking over the ideology via the man that US themselves shook hands with. So this is one of the reasons. The other reason is if Israel becomes more aggressive and this becomes a third war that the Israel has to fight in the Middle East, not just for its survival, but to ensure that another terrorist group does not take over Syria, which will have to face off later on in its entire fight for existence in the Arab world. This is the second reason why the US is interfering. So they placed a man in uniform in power. They shook hands. They called him a tall, strong, beautiful, handsome man. But he was, as before, an incarcerated Al-Qaeda Muslim Brotherhood man. And he's just making sure that the optics of the war looks good when he calls for ceasefire, while his own government officials are completely complicit in this ethnic genocide happening in Syria.
Shruti, very briefly before we move on, what comes next? A fragile truce somewhat holding, but reports of further violence taking place in the region. Also, you alluded there to Israeli involvement in this conflict and potential escalation. How do you see this playing out over the coming weeks and months?
Well, peace through power is the only way that Syria is now going to watch any peace. So I believe the Druze will have to be armed, the Christians will have to be armed. There's not going to be peace without the barrel of the gun pointing at the heads of the Sunni Islamist jihadist regime that has been placed by the US. The US will have to keep its pressure on, and lifting sanctions or allowing more power to flow through the hands of Al-Sharaa is not the way to go through it. So my assumption is that the US should be closely monitoring it, while Israel should be helping to arm the people that are actually facing off the gunfire in Sweida and other regions.
Shruti Dasgupta, thank you ever so much for taking the time to discuss this complex topic. We will continue to bring you all the developments from Syria.